أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. صلى الله عليه وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله، صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. غريب يا مظلوم كربلاء، ما خاب من تمسك بكم وأمن من لجأ إليكم. يا ليتنا فيا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال تعالى في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الدين عند الله الإسلام وما اختلف الذين أوتوا الكتاب إلا من بعد ما جاءهم العلم بغيا بينهم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Surah Abasa is Surah 80 of the Quran, and it's found in the last juz' of the Quran. Many of us are familiar with Surah Abasa. We probably learned it in madrasa. There's a verse in Surah Abasa that I'd like to begin our discussion with tonight. And this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, فَلْيَنظُرِ الْإِنسَانُ إِلَىٰ طَعَامِهِ. And let man look at and consider his food. There's a narration that tells us that one of the contemporaries of Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, our fifth holy Imam, by the name of Zayd al-Shaham. Zayd al-Shaham was a companion of our fifth Imam, and he asks the Imam to explain the esoteric meaning of this particular verse, verse 24 of Surah Abasa. Because we know that the Quran has a zahir and it has a batin. It has an apparent meaning and it has a hidden meaning, an esoteric meaning. And some of the companions of the Imams, they want to access those deeper meanings of the Quran. So he asks the Imam, what is the deeper message of this verse? Now we know that the apparent meaning is that Allah wants us to look at our food, because if we consider the food that we eat, it will lead us to discover Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes we forget that food in and of itself is a miracle. The problem is we're so far removed from farming and agriculture that we don't realize the miracle of food, how this delicious food is generated by the earth, it's produced by the earth. Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he puts his finger on a deeper message in this verse, the esoteric message. And the Imam alayhi salam, he says the esoteric meaning of this ayah is ilmuhu alladhi ya'khudhu amman ya'khudhu. The Imam says the esoteric meaning of this verse is, let the human being consider the knowledge that he consumes, the information that you consume. Where are you getting this information from? So we have to be selective in terms of our physical nourishment, but we also have to be selective in terms of the information that we consume. It's important what we put in our bodies, but it's more important to reflect on what we put in our hearts, what we put in our minds. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, as you probably have seen, the theme of our lectures, these two sessions, we're going to be looking at and navigating the isms of our time. I think many of you who will go to high school, who enter into the universities, you find yourself bombarded by isms. Marxism, capitalism, liberalism, socialism, feminism, and you often wonder, which ideologies should I subscribe to? Which belief systems are in line with Islamic values and which are not? There's been a very concerning trend over the past several years and maybe even several decades where, especially in recent times, we see American Muslims embracing ideas of the progressive left. What we see, my dear brothers and sisters, is that oftentimes, especially when we're young, when we're high school students, when we're college students, we are very quick to embrace ideologies without examining their origins and the underlying messages of those ideologies. We have this problem where we uncritically embrace ideologies, not realizing that much of what these ideologies purport are actually in contradiction with fundamental Islamic values. Now, of course, time doesn't allow us to unpack and deconstruct all of the different isms of our time, but I'd like to focus on, I think, a couple of isms that have become very prevalent in the Muslim community and even especially in the Shia community. And that is what I would call two extremes. And that is feminism on one side, and on the other side of the spectrum, you have what is known as the red pill movement. Red pillism, as some would call it. So tonight what I'd like to do, I'd like to examine and deconstruct Western modern feminism in order for us to understand where does Islam and feminism align and where does it diverge. Because the reality is, my dear brothers and sisters, whenever you have an ideology that is embraced by a significant swath of the human population, chances are there are elements of truth in it. So we shouldn't have this black and white approach to any of these ideologies. You're going to find some good, and you're going to find some things that are problematic. And this applies to both feminism as well as the red pill movement. Because you have a huge segment of the population that is enamored by these new ideas, by these concepts. Now, before we delve into our discussion tonight, it's important for us to reflect on Surah Az-Zumar, ayah number 18, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually gives a very beautiful description of the believer. And this is very relevant to our discussion for tonight and tomorrow night. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He describes the believers, He describes them as being what? الَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلَ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَ. A believer is that person who listens attentively, who is a critical thinker, who listens and is able to follow that which is best. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is essentially saying that a mu'min, a believer, is a person of discernment. A mu'min is supposed to have such a high degree of discernment that they can discern between what is good and what is better, let alone what is good and what is corrupted. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's a given that a mu'min should be able to identify what is religiously problematic and what is religiously sound. But Allah is saying, no, a mu'min is even better than that. A mu'min is even more sophisticated. A mu'min can discern between what is good and what is best. And a mu'min follows what is ahsan, what is best. Now, my dear brothers and sisters, many of you know that I spend some time on social media. Maybe you've seen me on social media. And one of the things that I like to do kind of as a social experiment, I like to read that I find on social media, especially bios of Muslims, bios of fellow Shia Muslims. And a lot of the bios are quite similar. You have, name and then age, and then you have 313, right? Very presumptuous to think that I'm one of the 313. But in any case, I'm going to assume that that's your area code and not, a claim that you're making that inshallah you're one of the 313. But then oftentimes what do you see? Especially among many sisters, you see feminists. Now, I don't blame brothers or even sisters for being attracted to feminism, because I think that the reality is women do suffer in many societies. They are deprived of some basic rights. And it's a very logical reaction to gravitate towards an ideology that gives you a language to articulate your grievances. It's very natural. But the question is, my dear brothers and sisters, when you take the term feminism, so tonight I want to kind of give you a quick overview of the historical development of this movement. What are some of the problematic concepts? And I'll compare and contrast the statements of feminists with the statements of the Prophet to see if these are things that can be reconciled. Now, when you take the term feminist or feminism, you automatically are confronted with a problem. And the problem is, so many different groups now lay claim to the term feminism. So much so that the term has become so convoluted that it is effectively rendered meaningless. What do I mean by this? You have people, for example, who are ultra-conservative, who identify as feminists. And each of them have their own definitions that speak to their lived experiences and their sensibilities. You have, for example, social feminists. You have atheist feminists. You have radical feminists. You have Christian feminists. You have Jewish feminists. You have Muslim feminists. You have Marxist feminists. When you say feminism, that's an umbrella term that encompasses so many different strands and ideologies that oftentimes they themselves fight with each other and criticize and critique each other. So, for example, an atheist feminist is oftentimes going to speak about the importance of dismantling religious institutions, especially organized religion, because they would argue that organized religion perpetuates the problem of systemic racism. You have, for example, socialist feminists who will speak about the importance of fair distribution of wealth, and so on and so forth. In fact, you will find under the umbrella of feminism, you'll find ultra-conservative women who are advocating for women's rights based on scripture. And you'll also have women who work in the adult industry who also identify as feminists. So on the one hand, you have feminists who speak out against the objectification of women who pride themselves as feminists. And then you have women who work in the adult industry who are making money off of the objectification of their own bodies, and they also call themselves feminists. So from the beginning, we have to understand that the term feminism doesn't really mean anything anymore. It's a term that has a lot of baggage. It's a term that is highly convoluted. Now, if you go online and you Google feminism, you'll find a number of definitions. And some of the definitions on the surface seem to be very benign. And in fact, they seem to be attractive. So for example, one definition of feminism is the advocacy of women's rights, the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes. Now, I remember as an undergrad student, you read that and you're like, that sounds good to me. What's the problem? What's the issue? But here, from an Islamic perspective, the operative word is equality. Because equality means what? Whatever we affirm for a man, we affirm the exact same thing for a woman. Now, from an Islamic perspective, one would argue that a better definition, if we want to redefine feminism in a way that's more in line with Islamic values, you would probably have to say the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equity as defined by Allah and His Messenger. On the basis of fairness. Because if you give the exact same rights to men and women, you will inevitably harm both, because we are different. So who decides what is equitable? Human society? The same society today that can't even tell me what a man is and what a woman is, they're going to tell me what's equitable? Or does revelation have the answer? Now, with that said, as mu'mineen, before we subscribe to any ism, we have to first ask ourselves, where do these ideas come from? Otherwise, there's no difference between us and the people of Sham. They just internalized whatever propaganda they heard. They were not critical thinkers. You can't be a critical thinker and think to yourself, Ali was martyred. What was he doing in a masjid? Was he a Muslim? That means you have people who are uncritically embracing Umayyad propaganda. What's the difference between us today? If we uncritically embrace ideas of the progressive left, ideas of feminism, liberalism, and add all the other isms without thinking deeply about the origin of these movements. Who are the main thinkers of these movements? What is the ultimate aim of this movement? Now, let's begin our discussion by speaking about the historical development of feminism. Now, some scholars have said, and when I say scholars, I'm not talking about Islamic scholars. I'm speaking about, Western academic scholars who've studied Western modern feminism. They say that you can trace feminism back to the Renaissance period. But again, we don't want to go that far back because, time is limited. So let's start with a very important figure by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft. She's probably one of the earliest feminist thinkers. She wrote a book in 1792. 1792. And the book was called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. A seminal text in feminist thought. Now you have to understand that at her time, women were denied equal access to education. Men had access to high education. Women were deprived. There were many obstacles that blocked women from obtaining education. So she writes this book, and one of the central arguments of her book is what? She basically argues that a woman's education ought to match her position in society. If a woman is going to be the caretaker of children and raise the next generation of children, then it's only logical that she should be well educated, because she is the one who's raising the next generation. Now again, as Muslims, these discussions are not really relevant to us. Why? Because our tradition, if you look at the words of the Prophet ﷺ never said that women need to be banned from education. Rather, the Prophet ﷺ, what does he say? طَلَبُ الْعِلْمِ فَرِيضَةٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُؤْمِنٍ وَمُؤْمِنَةٍ. seeking knowledge, especially religious knowledge. And here knowledge is about knowledge of God, knowledge of His deen. Seeking knowledge is a duty. It's not just an option. It's an obligation upon believing men and believing women. In fact, if you look at the women of Ahlul Bayt, some of the greatest scholarship has come out from the family of the Prophet. So, as Muslims, again, when you look at the origins of feminism, Islam endorses this, endorses education, access to education for women. Now, what happens is that now this text and this movement really plants the seeds for the next phase in the women's movement in feminism. And that is, it plants the seeds for the women's suffrage movement. The women's suffrage movement is basically the advocacy to gain the right to vote, for example, to be equal participants in a democratic system. And therefore we start with first wave feminism. I'm going to cover 3 waves of feminism. Once we understand the 3 waves of feminism, you will have a good understanding of this ideology and where Islam endorses certain concepts and where Islam runs in contrast to the things that are being taught. So with first wave feminism, so we're looking now at the mid 18th century so we're looking at the mid 18th century to the 19th century. There are certain figures that emerge that are seen as prominent leaders of the feminist movement. You have people like Susan B. Anthony in America. You have Elizabeth Cady Stanton in Europe. And they are basically leading a movement. And by the way, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an abolitionist. So a lot of the women who were advocating for women's rights in Europe, they were abolitionists. Now, what ended up happening is, in 1840, these women, they wanted to attend a meeting with other men to discuss strategies on how to liberate blacks. They were abolitionists. These women were not permitted to sit at the table with men. They were excluded from this meeting. So what happened is that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, what she does is she's frustrated with this, and in 1848, she composes the Declaration of Sentiments, right? The Declaration of Sentiments in Seneca Falls, and the basic demand is that women should be given full rights of citizenship. Now, many of us may not know this, but up until the mid-1800s in New York, for example, a woman could not own property. In fact, for most of European history, even if you look at America, women were basically the properties of their husbands. You know, this tradition of taking your husband's last name, it was rooted in this idea that when you get married to a woman, there's a transfer of ownership. The father transfers ownership of the daughter to the husband. And in many states, in the United States, we're talking about 150 years ago, if a woman were to have committed a crime, her husband would be liable because a woman did not have legal status. She did not have the right to vote. She did not have the right to own property. She was basically the property of her husband. Now, these women, again, first wave feminism, they're basically seeking what? They simply want to be participants in society. They want to be able to own property. They want to have citizenship independent of their husbands. Now, from an Islamic perspective, Islam has no issue with this. This struggle is irrelevant to the story of Islam. Why? Because if you look at the biography of the Prophet, if you look at the history of Islam, Sayyidah Khadija alayhi salam owned a business empire. Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, during the lifetime of the Prophet, she was given ownership of fadak. Muslim women never had to struggle for the right to own property because it's something that was granted to them through the Quran and through the teachings of Ahlul Bayt. So again, we sympathize with those early feminists because essentially they were deprived of their God-given rights, their rights as dictated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger. Now, it's important for us to not ignore, it's important for us that we don't ignore the anti-black sentiments of first wave feminists. We shouldn't think that these were just a bunch of old sweet ladies who'd make apple pie on the weekends and during the week they would basically advocate for women's rights. Let me share with you a quotation from Susan B. Anthony, who is seen as kind of the primary coordinator of the women's suffrage movement in the US. She writes, the old anti-slavery school says women must stand back and wait until the Negroes shall be recognized. So she's basically saying that it seems that our liberation is going to come second after the liberation of Negroes. She says, but we say, if you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage, if you're not going to give complete voting rights to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. Susan B. Anthony is basically saying that if you want to give the right to vote to all people, do so. But if you're not going to do that, at least give it to those who are the most intelligent in society. If you're going to do it gradually, give the right to vote to the most intelligent members of society. And then she says, if intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence in government, let the question of the woman be brought up first and that of the Negro last. Susan B. Anthony is saying what? That we want our rights first because we are more intelligent and more moral than blacks. My dear brothers and sisters, it's very important that we know this history because you don't want to attach yourself to a movement that speaks a language that is antithetical with Islamic values. This type of messaging would not be condoned by the Prophet ﷺ. Now, continuing our discussion, so this is first wave feminism. Now, then we go to second wave feminism. Now, up until now, everything is okay. Women are asking for equal access to education. They want to have the right to own property. They don't want to be considered the property of their husbands. All of that is, they want the right to vote. These are all rights that were conferred upon women by the Islamic tradition. Now, we go to second wave feminism. And this is where things get a little shaky. Second wave feminism did not simply just want to have women as full participants in society. What happens is that second wave feminists sought to do what? They sought to abolish traditional social institutions like marriage and motherhood. One of the most important books that was written during this period was by a famous feminist theorist, a philosopher, Simone de Beauvoir. She wrote a book in 1949 known as The Second Sex. And she basically argued that femininity is completely disconnected from biology. The argument now is what? That what it means to be a woman has nothing to do with science and biology. She basically is arguing that gender is a social construct. Women are the way that they are because society has influenced them. Women have certain tendencies because society has influenced them. It has nothing to do with biology. In fact, she writes, nature does not define woman. It is she who defines herself by reclaiming nature for herself in her affectivity. Now, some have asked her, why is it that women generally tend to want to be mothers and wives? Is this just something that's, a societal thing? She basically argues that women want to be mothers and wives because they're indoctrinated. They're brainwashed. It has nothing to do with their biological impulse. In 1975, she wrote, "No woman," now imagine that, I want you to listen to these words very carefully. And again, I'm not telling you whether to be a feminist or not. I just want to give you the information so you can make an informed decision about which ideologies you're going to attach yourself to and whether they're Islamically endorsed. She writes, "No woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children." She says no woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children. Society should be totally different. Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one. In 1963, another important feminist, she wrote a book. Her name is Betty Friedan. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique, in her book, she describes motherhood as a comfortable concentration camp. She describes motherhood, which is very sacred in Islam. The same motherhood that is a gateway for you and I for Jannah. Motherhood is what? A comfortable concentration camp. Now, I think this is offensive to anyone who spent any time in a concentration camp. You're comparing, of course, this is hyperbole. But the point here is, she's basically saying that to be a mother, to be a wife, to be a housewife turns women into walking corpses. And basically, a woman who is relegated to this sort of life is a bored and unproductive woman. Now, there is no doubt, brothers and sisters, that there are husbands who mistreat their wives. There are many husbands out there who stifle the intellectual and spiritual development of their wife. No one is denying that. But the solution is not to disparage the institution of motherhood. The solution is not to say that being a stay-at-home mother has no value. It's something that's a comfortable concentration camp. The solution is to teach those men to appreciate the contribution of women, to appreciate the wife that you might have who's at home, to appreciate the mother who is raising children. My dear brothers and sisters, the problem with second wave feminism is that many of these second wave feminists, they propose that the way for a woman to liberate herself is to imitate men. And therein lies the problem. To stay at home. By the way, brothers and sisters, you would be shocked if you were to see the messages that I receive from young ladies who say that I wish I could just be a housewife. I wish I could just be a stay-at-home mother. But the problem is, society sees you as a failure if you decide to be a stay-at-home wife or a stay-at-home mother. Why? Because much of this literature disparages and denigrates and doesn't attach much value to domestic labor. I want to share with you a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Betty Friedan says that motherhood is a comfortable concentration camp. That women who do household chores, they're like walking. It doesn't have value. You're wasting your life. What does the Prophet say? Imām Ḥasan reports. Imam Sadiq says, Salama, the wife of the Prophet, she once came to the Prophet and she said, Ya Rasulullah, what is the reward for us women who are serving our families? You know, a lot of women during the time of the Prophet, they saw the men go to Badr and Uhud, and they see these men defending Islam in the battlefields. And Fulan was martyred, and this person earned the rank of Shahada. And a lot of these women felt like, you know, we're missing out on this glory. We're missing out on this great reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these women felt excluded. They felt as though a lot of these household chores, they don't have value. The men are doing the real important work, and we're doing things that are just meaningless. Listen to what the Prophet says. Don't tell me about what, you know, Betty Friedan said or Simone de Beauvoir. We're the followers of the Prophet. We take our ethics and our morality from Rasulullah. What does the Prophet say? He says, and I want the brothers to listen to this, and I want the sisters to listen to this. He says, أيما امرأة رفعت من بيت زوجها شيئا من موضع إلى موضع تريد به صلاحا إلا نظر الله إليها ومن نظر الله إليها لم يعذب. The Prophet, he says, any woman who so much as moves something from one place to another place in her house to make her family more comfortable. You see a little table and you just move the table a little bit. You rearrange a room. You just move one thing around. You rearrange one thing to make the house more comfortable for your husband and your children. The Prophet says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will look at her with mercy. And whoever Allah looks at with mercy, He will never punish them. Now, I'm not sharing this hadith so the brothers can say, see, I'm going to sit back and you do all the work. The Prophet used to help with the household chores. Amir al-Mu'mineen used to do it. But what I'm saying, especially to those sisters who might feel that, you know, doing the laundry and doing the dishes and doing all of these things, it has no value. I'm just wasting my time. I can't wait to do something that actually has value. Believe me, brothers and sisters, sometimes it's the things that we take for granted that are those actions that will take us to Jannah. The things that we don't think are important, they are important. To be at the service of your family. Now again, yes, are there husbands who don't appreciate their wives? Yes. Your husband doesn't appreciate you, but you know who does? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If your husband never thanks you, and Allah will hold him responsible for not being gracious and not being kind. But even if you have a husband who never appreciated you, Asiya bint Muzahim also had a husband who didn't appreciate her. Asiya, who was married to Fir'aun never appreciated her. But Allah never let any of the good deeds of Asiya go in vain, and she is one of the 4 greatest women in our history. This is important for us to understand, my dear brothers and sisters. Now, this is second wave feminism. And by the way, some of the sharpest critics of feminism are women. You know, sometimes we think that, oh, the men are the ones who are opposed to feminist ideology. No, it's actually women. In fact, one of the things that we see with second wave feminism is that it was happening simultaneously with the sexual revolution of the 1960s, with the introduction of contraceptives. And what happened was, women were being encouraged to liberate themselves from these traditional institutions, and many of these second wave feminists were encouraging promiscuity. They were encouraging zina, because you don't need to be married anymore to engage in intimacy. As Muslims, my dear brothers and sisters, we have to understand that these movements, not only were they liberating women from traditional institutions. They were liberating them from morality itself. And we Muslims, we have to hold ourselves not to a man-made morality. We have to hold ourselves to a divinely ordained morality. Now I come to third wave feminism. Now, of course, one of the critiques of second wave feminism is that it excluded, even first wave feminism, it excluded black women. Second wave feminism, you have a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly. She was a conservative woman. She was a political activist who actually opposed feminists in the 1960s and 70s. And she said that feminism is a threat to conservative American values. Some of the most scathing criticisms of second wave feminism come from women who saw it as a threat to the traditional family unit. Now, we come to third wave feminism. Third wave feminism included more women from different ethnic backgrounds. And here, it gets very dangerous. Just to give you a sense as to where this movement is going. So again, it started off as we just want equal access to education. We want the right to own property. We want to be full citizens in the eye of the law. And then gender is a social construct. Marriage is a concentration camp. Okay, where is this train going now? Third wave feminism. One of the most prominent third wave feminists, Shulamith Firestone, she writes, the end goal of the feminism revolution, these are not my words, this is coming from some of the leading thinkers. The end goal of the feminism revolution must be unlike that of the first feminist movement, not just the elimination of privilege. She's saying that our end goal is not just to eliminate male privilege. So what's the goal? But of the sex distinction itself. We need to eliminate this concept of man and woman. You see where this is going? There is no such thing as gender. There is no such thing as, these are all arbitrary things. And this is where you have gender fluidity. This is where you have gender is entirely performative. And this is why today, in 2023, a simple question like, what is a woman, has sparked global debate. This ism that some of our sisters and unfortunately some of our brothers attach themselves to don't realize that you have associated yourself with an ideology that has completely destroyed the family unit and the fabric of human society. This is the reality. The transgender movement was an outgrowth of feminism, whether you like it or not. These are the facts on the ground. Now, in terms of the specific things, and I've already alluded to this, and we'll conclude shortly, some of the most problematic ideas within feminism, and sometimes these are ideas that are explicitly stated, sometimes they're implicit, and sometimes it's just part of the rhetoric and the sentiment of feminist thinkers. There are some ideologies that are very problematic, some concepts that are contrary to Islamic values. And one of them is, and many feminists have made this argument, sometimes they do it jokingly, but it's had a very negative impact, and that is women should strive to be completely independent of men. Men are trash. We don't need men. The reality is you need men, men need women, and women need men. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created a system where we need each other. If you didn't need men, Allah would have never created them. And if men didn't need women, Allah would have never created them. To say that we don't need men contradicts your own biology and your own nature. We need each other. You know, Gloria Steinem, and she was one of the leaders of second wave feminism in America. She said, and again, she was probably joking, but I think there is some truth to this message. She says, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Right? A fish doesn't need a bicycle. Right? So she's basically saying that women don't need men. Men are useless. Now, again, this is coming from a place of frustration. And I think we have to have the maturity to admit that men, many men, have failed to rise to the occasion as true men, as dignified men, as responsible men who are protectors and providers. Feminism exists as a reaction to the extreme oppression of some men. So it's a very logical movement. But again, it started off with reasonable requests. But the problem is, when human beings are trying to fix societal problems, they oftentimes overcorrect. Their solutions become extreme. Now, this is myth number one, that women don't need men. We need each other. In fact, there was a study conducted in 2019 by Cornell University that asked women what matters most to them. And among the things that matter most to women is knowing that they have a man on whom they can depend. We need each other. Society is better when we look after each other, when we protect and we provide. The second myth perpetuated by certain strands of feminism is, as I mentioned, gender being a social construct. As Muslims, we believe, of course, there are certain elements of femininity and masculinity that are shaped by culture, but to say that gender is completely divorced from biology is completely at odds with what Islam teaches. Islam teaches us that gender is not a social construct, but it's a divine construct. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in this way. It's not a social construct. There are real differences between men and women that cannot just be chalked up to societal influences. That's why when a man is incarcerated, he's put in a men's prison. If we're all the same and gender is just a social construct, why don't we mix men and women up in prisons? Why doesn't LeBron James play against a female athlete? Because it's not going to happen, let's be honest. Men have 20 times the testosterone in their bodies. We're different on a hormonal level, on a genetic level. Psychologically, we're different. And this is why when you look at Islamic law, many of our Islamic laws are fundamentally gendered. Not because Allah is biased towards men, it's because Allah is the wise creator who takes it into consideration the real differences between men and women. Perhaps one of the greatest lies ever told, especially to women, is that a career is much more meaningful than marriage and having children. Again, I know many sisters who embraced this ideology in their 20s and 30s. And they had the mentality that I don't need a man in my life. I want to just focus on my career. I don't want to get married. But guess what happens? That maternal instinct doesn't go away. You find yourself in your 40s and you realize that career is actually not the most fulfilling thing in life. You want to have children. But at 40, the reality is your options are very limited. And if you want to have children, you might not have a husband or a child. There are many women who end up being single for the rest of their lives because they bought into these lies. I'm not trying to bash women. I have a daughter myself. This is coming from a place of care. I don't want people in our community to make decisions that cannot be corrected later on in life. We don't want to make decisions that we cannot reverse. And these are not just my words, and I'll conclude here. Germaine Greer was an Australian feminist. She was a radical feminist. They conducted an interview with her, and I want to read to you her exact quotation. She basically says, I was desperate for a baby. She had put off marriage. Again, the mentality that marriage and motherhood is a comfortable concentration camp. I don't need a man. This is not important. Fighting traditional gender roles and so on and so forth. She says, I was desperate for a baby. and I have the medical records to prove it. I still, listen to this, I still have pregnancy dreams waiting with vast joy, something that will never happen. Isn't that sad? That's what happens, my dear brothers and sisters, when we uncritically embrace ideologies without reflecting on their origins and what are the underlying messages and what are the objectives. We shouldn't blindly follow anyone, any feminist or any academic or any public intellectual. The only person who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to unconditionally obey is Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Allah doesn't tell us when the Prophet speaks, listen and take the best from what he says. That applies to other people, because people, they have good and they have bad. They have things that are sound and things that are off. But with the Prophet, what does Allah say? وَمَا آتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. Whatever the Prophet gives you, take it. Because he's connected to me. It's pure guidance. You don't have to worry about human error. You don't have to worry about people taking you astray. When it comes to feminism, you have to worry because these are woman-made ideologies, man-made ideologies. We don't want to be among those who we describe in Surah Al-Fatiha, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ. There are many people that are looking for truth, but they've gone astray because they followed man-made ideologies. They are seeking man-made solutions. We need divine solutions. We need the solutions of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. And on a night like this, we commemorate the departure of that perfect human being. Al-Insanul Kamil, the perfect human being, who embodied the highest levels of human virtue. Allah, when He describes the Prophet, He says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. When Allah speaks about other prophets, He might highlight certain aspects of their life, like take inspiration from the sabr of Ayub, take inspiration from the patience of Ayub, take inspiration from the justice of Sulaiman, from the zuhud of Isa. But with Rasulullah, Allah doesn't mention any specific quality, because you can be inspired from everything in the life of the Prophet. He is the symbol of patience. He's the symbol of zuhud. He's the symbol of wisdom. He's the symbol of chivalry. He's the symbol of justice. And on these nights, he is on his deathbed. I want you to imagine, I want you to take your mind and your heart 14 centuries into the past. And imagine you are in Medina and you are sitting in that room with Amir al-Mu'mineen, with Sayyida Fatima alayhi salam, with Imām Ḥasan, with Imām Hussein, all of them surrounding Rasulullah as the Prophet is experiencing agonizing pain from the poison, as he's going in and out of consciousness. One narration says that Hassan and Hussein, they were very fond of their grandfather. These are the same Hassan and Hussein who, when the Prophet would go down into sujood, they would climb on his back. And the Prophet, he loved Hassan and Hussein. What are they doing on a night like this? They are climbing on the chest of Rasulullah. Hassan and Hussein are on the chest of Rasulullah. The Prophet ﷺ, he's going in and out of consciousness. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, thinking that they might be causing trouble to the Prophet, or they might be overwhelming him with their weight. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he tries to remove Hassan and Hussein from the chest of the Prophet. Do you know what the Prophet says? قال دعهما يا علي. Oh Ali, leave them. Why يا رسول الله? دعهما يا علي فإنهما سيصبحان غريبان في هذه الأمة. Oh Ali, leave them on my chest. Let me smell them, let me hug them, let me embrace them. For surely after me they will be two ghareebs in this ummah. The Prophet ﷺ has very intimate conversations in these last days. One narration says that he summons Amir al-Mu'mineen and he summons Fatima al-Zahra. The narration says that Rasulullah, he puts the hands of Fatima in the hands of Ali. And what does the Prophet say to Ali? He says, Ya Ali, هذه وديعتي عندك. Oh Ali, this Fatima is a trust I am putting in your hands. Ya Rasulullah, what would you have said if you were to see what happened after your death? The narrations say that after the death of Rasulullah, Fatima would weep day and night. She used to cry day and night because Fatima's attachment to Rasulullah was not just the attachment of a daughter to her father. She recognized him as the messenger of Allah, the connection between the heavens and the earth, the one who used to host Jibreel. After the death of the Prophet, some of the residents of Medina, they come to Amir al-Mu'mineen and they say, Oh Ali, the weeping of Fatima is keeping us awake. The sorrow and the lamenting of your wife is keeping us awake. Can you have her stop lamenting over her father? Allahu Akbar. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he constructs a place for Fatima to weep. A place outside of Medina, at the outskirts of Medina. And this place became known as Baytul Ahzan, the house of sorrows. The place where Fatima used to go and lament for her father. Fatima al-Zahra, she would go to the grave of Rasulullah. She would miss the Prophet. She would take some of the sand of his grave and she would smell that sand. She wanted to smell the body of the Prophet. She would say, ماذا على من شم تربة أحمد ألا يشم مدى الزمان غواليا قل للمغيب تحت أطباق الثرى هل تسمع صوتي وندائيا صبت علي مصائب لو أنها صبت على الأيام صرنا لياليا. All of you fathers who have daughters, you know that when your daughter is distressed, who does she come to complain? A daughter comes to her father to complain. Fatima al-Zahra, she goes to the grave of her father. What does she say to her father? That Ya Rasulullah, صُبَّتْ عَلَيَّ مَصَائِبٌ. Ya Rasulullah, oh my father, many calamities were poured upon me after you. So much so that if they were poured upon the day, they would turn into night. On one occasion, Lady Fatima alayhi salam, what does she do? She summons Bilal ibn Rabah, the mu'adhin of Rasulullah. She says, Oh Bilal, you have not recited the adhan since the death of Rasulullah. I want you to recite the adhan so I can remember the days with my father. The narration says, Bilal, he goes to the masjid. He honors the request of Sayyidah Fatima. He goes to the masjid. He raises his voice with the adhan. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. The residents of Medina, they hear the voice of Bilal echoing. People start to stream out of their homes. Many of them think that has the Prophet been resurrected? This is the voice of Bilal. This is the voice of the mu'adhin of Rasulullah. The entire streets of Medina, they're filled with people. People are entering the masjid. Bilal, he begins reciting, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Fatima al-Zahra begins to weep. She begins to cry. She starts to reminisce those beautiful days with Rasulullah until the mu'adhin, until Bilal calls out, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. As soon as Fatima hears the name of her father, the narrations say that she fell unconscious. Ya mu'mineen, at that moment, Hassan and Hussein, those two young boys, they run to the masjid and they say, Ya Bilal, iqta' al-adhan. Oh Bilal, stop the adhan. We fear that our mother Fatima will die of grief. La hawla wa la قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us our sins, to pardon us for our transgressions. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept these tears, to cleanse our sins through these tears for Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam and Rasulullah and the Ahlul Bayt. We ask you, Allah, do not deprive us of the ziyarah of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Do not deprive us of the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein and his noble companions. Keep us on the path of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Let us be steadfast in our faith. And most importantly, we ask you, O Allah, to honor us and to crown us with the shafa'ah, the intercession of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad on the day of judgment. يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.